job. And I'm curious to know if they say that in New Hampshire, because they don't say that in Florida. And so my view on all this is I want to know how many jobs these tax increases the President proposes will create, because if they're not creating jobs and they're not creating new taxpayers, they're not solving the problem. Senator Ayotte, I don't know what your perspective is on that.
Senator Rubio, you know, I couldn't agree more with what my colleague from Florida has said, that we need to create a positive climate to create jobs. But one thing we do know is that that doesn't happen by more spending in Washington. The recent report that came out about the President's stimulus package has shown that it costs $278,000 per job created by that stimulus package, and yet we had to borrow so much money, nearly $1 trillion, to create a limited number of jobs that cost us $278,000 a job. I do come from a small business family, and my husband started a landscaping and snow plowing business. I work with him to start that business. And New Hampshire is a small business state. As I campaigned up and down our state, I talked to so many small business owners, and I never had a small business owner tell me that they were being taxed too little. Please tax me more. What I did hear was too many burdensome regulations from Washington were coming down and making it difficult for our small businesses to thrive and grow. And frankly, some of the taxes coming down from Washington making it difficult. You know, in the health care bill, there was a tax on medical device companies. New Hampshire has nearly 50 of those companies. And what I heard from those companies, and I've heard that even more recently, the tax in that health care bill on medical device companies is going to take away significant amounts of their research and development budget to create new products that will improve the quality of our health care and save lives. So the actions we're taking in Washington, we need to create a positive climate for our small businesses, not thinking that we create the jobs here in Washington. We know that it's the small businesses and the hardworking entrepreneurs and those that have a great idea in this country in the private sector that create those jobs. And they don't need more taxes and burdens from Washington. What we need to do is, frankly, get out of their way and allow them to thrive and grow and to create jobs for all of our children going forward. Senator Rubio, I don't know if you heard from businesses in Florida about the regulatory concerns and burdens from Washington hurting economic growth in the private sector.
Well, the truth is that throughout the campaign and even now, that's what I hear all the time from people, is that these regulations are making it harder, not easy, for them to create jobs. That, combined with the uncertainty of the tax code. They don't know what the taxes are going to be next year, but they read the newspaper, they listen to the news, and every time they hear talk about this tax increase stuff, it scares job creators. They make the decision, well, wait, you know what, maybe this is not the year to hire people, because we still don't know how much it's going to cost to hire people. The other great phrase here, you know, both Senator Ayotte and I have only been here a few months, so I think we're still learning the language of Washington. I hope it never becomes part of my permanent vocabulary, but one of the things that I have been hearing recently is this notion of everything should be on the table, which is funny because everything is not on the table, according to the President and others. For example, there's no serious discussion of a spending cap. I'd love to have a vote right. Why don't we have a vote on the balanced budget amendment? Why is that not on the table? Why is a balanced budget amendment not on the table? Why aren't we voting on that tomorrow? Because a balanced budget amendment basically says you can't spend money you don't have, which makes all the sense in the world to the rest of the people that live in the real world, but apparently that doesn't apply here, and the result is these problems that we face. But I actually think some things should be off the table. Let me tell you what should be off the table. Bad ideas. If something is a bad idea, it shouldn't be on the table. And I think it's a bad idea to pass things that are going to make it harder to hire people. How much higher do they want unemployment to be? So what is it? Here's, I think, what we have to ask ourselves. These tax increases that, as Senator Ayotte rightfully pointed out, along with the regulations, kill job creation in America. These tax increases don't do anything about the debt. They don't raise enough money to do anything significant about the debt. They don't create jobs. In fact, they kill them. So how could tax increases that they're outlining be a part of a solution? Why is it being offered? Because ultimately, these are smart people. They know the math. And I think the answer lies in the politics of all this. The politics of all this is pretty clear. This appears to be an effort to save face. The reality is that everyone here knows there's going to have to be some spending reduction of some level, because we have a spending problem. The reason why we're in the mess that we're in today with our debt is not because Americans don't pay enough in taxes. It's because we spend more money than we have at an alarming rate, not a little bit more than we have, a lot more than we have. So there's going to have to be some spending reductions, and it appears to me that the President and others in his party are positioning and are looking for some pound of flesh in return for these cuts so they can go back to their political base and say, look what we got. We got something out of this. We went after the people that made all this money. We went after the greedy billionaires and millionaires. We went after the oil companies, even though it has nothing to do with the debt. That's the only explanation for why this is even on the table. I think all bad ideas should be off the table. I think anything that kills jobs should be off the table. I think anything that hurts the ability of job creators to grow their business should be off the table. I think anything that helps increase the unemployment rate should be off the table. I think that's what should be off the table. I think anything that hurts our ability to grow our economy should be off the table. And I hope what should be on the table are things that force this government once and for all to put itself back on the path of sanity. Sanity basically means that we stop having a government that spends money it does not have. And I'll turn it over to Senator Ayotte to close, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to do this because I thought it was important to bring these points to the floor here today.
I want to thank Senator Rubio for his leadership on this issue and for the important issues that he has raised here today, because he's absolutely right that the class warfare is unproductive. The proposals that the President has made are not serious in terms of how much revenue they would even address, not even 10 days of our debt. And unfortunately, right now, the Leader of the Senate, what he has brought forward is a resolution, a non-binding sense of the Senate that does nothing to address the spending in Washington. And we are spending over 24% of our GDP or our economy right now. We've historically spent about 20% of our GDP. So our spending is way out of line for where we have spent over the 40-year historical level of our spending. And common sense, why not a balanced budget amendment? Why aren't we addressing that this week in the Senate instead of a non-binding resolution that, again, will have no effect, has no effect, won't reduce our deficit, won't help create any jobs, will not help our economy thrive? We should be addressing real legislation. A balanced budget amendment, I couldn't agree with my colleague from Florida more about living within our means. Families sit around their kitchen table, they make the tough decisions, they see the revenue coming in and the expenditures out, and Washington should do the same. Spending caps to ensure that we get ourselves, put those handcuffs on Congress to make sure that we're not spending this drastic 24% of our GDP right now and really bringing ourselves on a more responsible spending path going forward. And a budget resolution. It's been nearly 2 years since the Senate has passed a budget. And no business would run without a budget. Families make budgets, but here in the United States Senate, what we should be bringing to the floor is a real budget resolution that the parties can debate and put ourselves on a responsible fiscal path going forward, rather than voting on a sense of the Senate that will, again, not have any impact in the full force of law. With this deadline coming up for August 2nd, it is time for real legislative proposals and solutions. We've put some of the ideas out there, balanced budget, cap amendment, a real budget resolution, and I hope that my colleagues from the other side of the aisle will come forward so we can work together to address this fiscal crisis here and now so that my children, Senator Rubio's children, will have the same and greater opportunities than all of our children and grandchildren in the greatest country on earth. Thank you, Mr. President.
President.
Senator from Washington.
Mr. President, there is no question that we are at a point where we have to take substantial and painful steps to get our nation's fiscal house in order. That is why we are rightfully working to tighten our nation's belt at a time when American families are doing the same all over the country. But today I'm here to talk about one major difference in the way Republicans have proposed to go about addressing our budget and the way American families who understand shared sacrifice and equal burden have done it. Today, I'd like to point out one glaring omission in the Republicans' plan amid all their tough talk about fiscal responsibility. I'm here to ask Republicans why they are asking everyone to sacrifice except those who can afford it the most. I'm here to ask them why they are willing to risk not only defaulting on our nation's debt, but also the health care and benefits our veterans rely on, pay for our troops, Social Security benefits, and the Medicare system our seniors are counting on, all to defend tax breaks for oil and gas companies, sweetheart deals for corporations, and the most generous tax rates wealthy Americans have enjoyed in 60 years. Mr. President, sometimes it's hard for me to listen to some of my Republican colleagues talk at length about their newfound fiscal sensibilities here on the floor and in the press. It's difficult because, like many of them, I was here in 2000. I remember when President Clinton left office, we were on a course to completely pay down the $5.6 trillion debt by 2012. I remember the projections of surpluses. And I remember the efforts by many of us to safeguard that funding for our seniors and to pay down that debt. But I can also remember at that time, many Republicans couldn't wait to get their hands on the nation's credit card. And when they did, when President Bush took office, they spent lavishly. And Mr. President, a lot of that spending went to some of our nation's wealthiest individuals and companies. Throughout the Bush years, and particularly in the Bush tax cuts of 2001 and 2003, trillions of dollars in tax breaks went to the very wealthiest Americans. There were capital gains tax rollbacks, tax breaks designed to benefit corporate giants, and a new tax bracket that provided wealthy Americans the lowest tax rates they've enjoyed since World War II. And these tax breaks were all unpaid for, all handed out to those who could most afford to pay, and they were all put on the nation's credit card. But today, now that that credit card bill's come due, guess who won't be asked to pay their fair share? Unfortunately, under the Republican plan, it's the wealthy companies and individuals who have benefited the most from their spending. Corporations like ExxonMobil, who despite reporting a profit of over $10 billion in the first quarter of this year, at the same time, by the way, the gas prices for families across the country are rising, they are being protected from a rollback of tax subsidies for oil and gas giants. It's corporate CEOs who are now lobbying against closing the tax loopholes that they enjoy for private jets and yachts. And it's companies who all too often ship our American jobs overseas, but who still enjoy offshore tax havens. And guess who's drawn a line in the sand to protect these corporations and wealthy individuals? Well, it's the very same Republicans who were so quick to break out the nation's credit card back when we were running a surplus. The same Republicans who have repeatedly pledged to block any new revenues, even as we have met them far beyond halfway in these negotiations. And finally, guess who it is that's left to pick up the credit card tab under the Republican plan? Unfortunately, it's everyone else. It's seniors who under their plan will lose access to Medicare as we know it. It's students that will be asked to pay even more as their tuition rises. It's our family farmers and those who can't afford health care for their children. It is the middle-class families that have found themselves living paycheck to paycheck. Mr. President, if Republicans get their way, it will be everyone but those who can afford it most who will be left to sacrifice alone. Mr. President, unfortunately, the Republican approach is something that has become all too common in the aftermath of this recession. While the effects of this recession are being felt so profoundly by working families in lost jobs and lower wages and less financial security than ever before, the very wealthiest Americans seem to be doing pretty darn fine. On Sunday, I picked up the New York Times and noticed they ran an article that showed the salaries of the CEOs at America's largest companies grew by an average of 23% over last year's mark, 23%. The same article noted that over the past year, the pay for average workers declined. And it didn't even mention the thousands of layoffs at the same companies where those bonuses have skyrocketed. Unfortunately, that's the same economic theory that Republicans are now bringing to these budget negotiations. For those who can't afford it, This budget provides all the perks and none of the sacrifices, all the tax breaks, none of the revenues, all of the benefits, none of the pain. Mr. President, it doesn't have to be this way. We can have a plan that works for middle-class families and invests in our nation's future, a plan that balances tough but necessary spending cuts with new revenues that ensure those corporations and wealthy Americans are also paying their fair share, that restores fairness to this process by making sure that in these difficult times we are not balancing our budget solely on the backs of seniors and students and middle-class families. And most importantly, a plan that recognizes that, yes, we have a budget deficit and we need to address that. But, Mr. President, we also have an infrastructure deficit. We have an education and a skills deficit. And importantly, we have a jobs deficit. And the only way that we will address those deficits is to invest in education, in energy, and in infrastructure that will produce jobs both now and into the future. A worker who lost his job through no fault of his own doesn't just want to hear about cuts, cuts, cuts. They want to hear about how we are going to create jobs. Small business owner who had to shut her doors when the recession hit, customers stopped coming in, doesn't want to hear about debt ceilings. She wants to hear about how we are going to get the economy back on track. It cannot just be about slashing. It needs to be about investing in jobs and workers right here in America. And, Mr. President, that's what we should be working together forward. I understand time's not on our side in this debate. The truth is that Republicans aren't merely offering their everybody pays except the rich philosophy up for debate. They are holding our nation's economy hostage with it. By refusing to accept new revenues from corporate tax loopholes and tying that refusal to the nation's debt limit, they are rolling the dice on default. In fact, you know, in my 18 years on the Senate Budget Committee, I've never seen anything like what Republicans are willing to risk in these budget negotiations and who they are willing to risk it all for. Last week, the Bipartisan Policy Center put out a report that was authored, by the way, by a former Bush Treasury official about what would happen if Republicans continued to play chicken with default and the administration was forced to make desperate spending decisions this August. The scenarios were worse than grim. Potentially at risk are the benefits and health care we owe our veterans, loans for our small businesses that are struggling, food stamps for people who are struggling to buy groceries, Social Security checks for our seniors, unemployment benefits for millions of workers, and even active duty pay for our military. Yet by rejecting revenues in this deal and by not asking everyone to sacrifice and by dealing in ultimatums rather than compromise, Republicans are willing to put all these Americans at risk. And they're willing to risk it all in order to go to the mat to protect trillions of dollars in tax breaks for the wealthiest few. They're willing to chance loans for Main Street businesses in order to defend offshore tax breaks for multinational companies. They're willing to jeopardize troop pay in order to stand up for hedge fund managers. They're willing to gamble default on tax breaks for horse tracks. I believe that's a bet that all of us will lose. Mr. President, we were elected to work for Americans, not just the privileged few at the top. It's time to come to the table with flexibility. It's time for compromise. It's time for common sense. And it is time to ask everyone to sacrifice to meet a challenge that we all face together. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've heard a lot of talk on the Senate floor, including from the last speaker and certainly from the President of the United States about shared sacrifice. The White House spin is that the Democrats in the negotiations about extending the debt ceiling have conceded hundreds of billions of dollars in savings, and Republicans have conceded nothing, and therefore Republicans need to be willing to raise taxes. That's the mantra. That's the spin. There are two things wrong with this spin. First, it's wrong as a matter of fact, as I'll point out. And second, it would result in very bad policy. As Senator Rubio said a moment ago, the only thing that should be off the table is bad policy. And certainly anything that would hurt our economy and job creation at this time is bad policy. First, with regard to the assertion from some in the White House that Democrats have made all of the concessions and so it's Republicans' turn. The last speaker, as a matter of fact, said, and I will quote her directly, "Everybody pays except the rich." Well, I'd like to point out why that's absolutely not the case. The negotiations that Vice President Biden has presided over have talked about two different kinds of savings. On the discretionary side, that's the budget that we deal with every year, and on the mandatory side, that's spending programs like Medicare and Medicaid and some of TRICARE and some veterans benefits and Social Security and things of that sort. If the savings that the White House has attempted to portray as all coming from Democrat concessions refers to the discretionary part of this pie, then I would simply say that it's a false statement because we haven't discussed it. What we've talked about is setting a top-line budget number, a so-called 302A number in budget parlance, and that's what the members of the House and Senate would then have to spend. But there's been no discussion of where those savings come from. So it simply would be wrong to say that there's been any kind of negotiation about where that savings comes from and Democrats have made all of the concessions. There have been no concessions made by either side, as a matter of fact. If it's the mandatory side that we're talking about, it's true that we've had a lot of discussion about savings that can result from changes in the way that we operate some of these mandatory programs. Now, we're not talking about any major reform of Medicare or anything of that sort. But if I can just sort of characterize something in a very loose way as waste, fraud, and abuse, there are a lot of savings that can occur in various programs, and there are even some revenue increases that can result from increased fees and that sort of thing that do result in some additional savings overall on the mandatory side. In terms of the revenue increases, I would point out that between $153 billion and over $200 billion of the money on that side of the ledger actually comes from increased revenues. So when the White House says, well, revenues have to be on the table, the fact is revenues have been on the table. We've been talking about increased revenues. We're not talking about increasing taxes, but if the government sells something and gets money from it, that's revenue. If there is a user fee of some kind and we want to raise that to keep up with the times, that's revenue. And if you add up all of the revenues that we have agreed to, we Republicans have agreed to, it's between $150 and $200 billion. So it's simply false to suggest that we haven't been willing to talk about revenues and that all of the concessions have been on the Democratic side. Now, we've also had some spending reductions or less rate in the growth of spending in some of these mandatory programs on the table for discussion. And about 60% of those, in my calculation, are concessions that Republicans have made. About 40% are concessions Democrats have made. My Democratic counterparts would probably argue that it's somewhat different from their point of view. But the fact is both sides have made concessions. And even if you concede that they're 50-50, the fact is, therefore, Republicans have made as many concessions in these negotiations as have our Democrat colleagues. And by the way, one reason we've both been willing to make concessions is we agree we're in a dire circumstance here. And we sometimes have to get out of what we call our comfort zone and agree to things that in ordinary times we would never agree to, but we realize now we have got to make some changes. And so we're willing to make concessions that ordinarily we wouldn't. And we have, and so have the Democrats. And the net result, as I said, I think it's 60-40 on our side, plus all of the revenues that we've conceded. But if somebody on the other side said, no, it's 50-50 or something in that order, I wouldn't argue. But the fact is, it is false and misleading for the White House to suggest that all of the concessions have been made by the Democrats and none have been made by Republicans. That's simply factually incorrect. Secondly, the second thing that's wrong with this spin is that, as Senator Rubio said, bad ideas should be off the table. And it is a bad idea to raise taxes on an economy that's already sick. I mean, the last thing that we should be doing is raising taxes, as a result of which job creation would be inhibited. It's the worst medicine for a sick economy. And I asked one of my Democratic colleagues, why, since we shouldn't be raising taxes at this point in time, why there was such an insistence on his side. And his response was, well, you have to understand with us, it's kind of theological. Well, maybe it's theological, but I would argue that ideology here has a place to the extent that it is backed up by reality. But ideology that is not backed up by reality has no place in these negotiations. And raising taxes just for the sake of raising taxes, so that somebody can say, well, to their constituency, we did it, we were able to raise taxes. That's not a sound way to approach the problem. Thomas Sowell, one of the most erudite observers of the American scene, wrote in National View Online on July 5th a piece he titled Politics versus Reality. It goes to this point, and Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to insert this in the record.
Without objection.
Remarks. Thank you. But the whole point here about raising taxes are, this should not be about shared sacrifice. It shouldn't be about sacrifice at all. We're not talking about austerity. We should be talking about prosperity. In other words, the conditions by which everyone can do well, specifically how we can create jobs, so we can put Americans back to work, how our economy can grow. As I said, the worst medicine for a sick economy is raising taxes. And that's why Republicans oppose tax hikes. Not because, for example, I have some interest in protecting some Hollywood movie millionaire. I don't. That person's probably not in my political party. What I have an interest in is protecting America's small businesses so that they don't go broke, so they don't have to close up shop by imposing higher taxes on them. And that's exactly what the President's own Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy said would happen with one of the taxes that they propose to raise. This is repealing LIFO, which is an accounting term called meaning last in, first out. And the SBA Administration Office of Advocacy said that repealing LIFO, and I'm quoting now, would result in a tax increase for small businesses that could ultimately force many small businesses to close, end of quote. That's the President's own Office of Advocacy for the SBA. That's what I oppose, putting small businesses out of business just because of some theological attachment to raising taxes. Now, accountants have talked for a long time about what the best method of accounting is. IRS has always said that LIFO is perfectly acceptable, and about 36% of American businesses, primarily retailers and manufacturers, use this accounting technique. And it would be fine if we decide to say, well, we're going to go to a different technique. What would be wrong is to retroactively impose a tax on the people who have been using this accounting method as if they've been doing something wrong. They haven't. IRS has always said LIFO is fine, but it's all about revenue. We need more money to spend, so we're going to retroactively tax 36% of American businesses that use this accounting method. It's wrong, and that's why the Small Business Administration Office of Advocacy has said this could put many small businesses out of business. It's why we shouldn't be considering it. What are the other taxes they propose? Well, one of them is to cap itemized deductions. So you would only be able to deduct either 28% or maybe up to 35% of your income. Now, obviously, the first effect of this is to make it much more difficult for Americans to contribute to charity, to buy homes because they wouldn't have the advantage of the mortgage interest deduction, to pay medical expenses, and so on. And as the Wall Street Journal has editorialized, this is just a backdoor way of raising marginal tax rates without actually appearing to do so. But the biggest problem with this capping of deductions is not that it's going to hurt the millionaires. They're either going to be caught by the AMT or their income is so high that they're even going to be paying above AMT rates, notwithstanding these limits on deductions. The real people that this hurts are the small businesses that pay in the higher bracket. And we know that 50% of small business income falls in the top two brackets. Businesses have deductions that are the ordinary and necessary part of doing business. All businesses are allowed to take them, both corporate and non-corporate. Why would we eliminate the ability of small businesses to take the same kind of deductions that corporations can take by capping the amount of deductions that could be reported, that could be taken in income reported in the top two brackets? Final point about this is we know that efforts to tax millionaires and billionaires always end up taxing a lot more people than that. According to IRS, in 2008, there were only about 319,000 tax returns that showed an income of $1 million or more. But the number of returns falling in the top two brackets, the ones that are affected by this proposal of the Democrats, numbered more than 3.6 million people. These would be the people who are affected by this proposed increase in taxes. I would just parenthetically note two others. The last millionaire tax is the alternative minimum tax. It was created in 1969, targeted against 155 millionaires. Guess how many people it will apply to this year? 34.4 million Americans. So you aim for the millionaires, you end up hitting everybody else. The third tax that the Democrats talk about raising is the old favorite, big oil. This is so targeted, it only hits 5 companies out of the whole world, 5 American companies. So never mind we're punishing American businesses, American oil companies, who are in the same business as other companies all over the world. They're not being punished. But no, we're going to attack American businesses, who, by the way, employ 9.2 million Americans. We're going to say that they have to pay higher taxes than other businesses who are just like them. There are 3 particular tax provisions other businesses get to take: an R&D tax credit, research and development. Aren't we all for research and development? Yes, but not in the oil and gas industry. Where might they put that research and development money? Well, for example, into ensuring that when they sink a well deep in the Gulf of Mexico, that it will be environmentally safe. Nope, you can't deduct that. All other businesses will be able to, but not you. What sense does that make? It's bad policy. How about the usual and necessary business expense, the deduction for write-ups, for business investment? All other companies get to deduct that, but we would say to the oil companies, you don't get that same deduction. And perhaps most perniciously, we're trying to compete with foreign businesses, and so we say to Americans that earn income abroad, you can deduct against the taxes that you would owe here the taxes that you pay over there. All of the other world nations get to do that. Well, they would take that away from these particular kinds of companies. So this is discriminatory. It's job-killing. But most of all, it impacts American consumers directly, because every dollar of increased taxes is going to find its way into the price that we pay at the gas station when we buy gas. Now, who does that hurt there for? Does it hurt some millionaires and billionaires? Who owns the oil companies? Well, a lot of pensions do, a lot of retired teachers and firefighters and so on. People have to think this through. You're not hitting millionaires and billionaires. I know it sounds like good rhetoric, but when you're hitting American businesses who try to compete around the world and who develop a product which we would like not to have to pay $4 a gallon for, the last thing you want to do is to play politics by saying, well, for those particular folks, we're going to raise their taxes. I remember the last time we raised taxes on another millionaire kind of outfit, the yachts. It was a luxury tax that we opposed back in 1990. And it seemed like a good idea. It's just like this tax that they are talking about imposing on airplanes. They didn't actually talk about that in our meeting, so I don't know exactly what it is, but they say it would raise $3 billion over 10 years, which pays for hardly a fraction of the $14 trillion debt that we've got. Nonetheless, they want to go after private airplanes. Now, I don't know how many people work in the private airplane manufacturing business, but it was interesting that in 1990, when the luxury boat tax was passed, there were 7,600 jobs lost in the boating industry. And very quickly, the people who made the boats, a lot of them up in Massachusetts, decided this wasn't such a hot idea, and so they repealed the tax in 1993. By the way, it lost revenues because of the unemployment benefits and lost income tax revenue that had to be developed in order to offset the loss in business. The point of all of this is that when the administration and others talk about shared sacrifice of making some kind of rich business or rich person pay taxes, you have to think through what the effect is on the American economy and on job creation. And the reason that Republicans oppose these things is not because we love the person that pays the tax so much as we'd like for American jobs to be created, or at least not have more jobs lost. And the people who are proposing these tax cuts seem to be absolutely oblivious to the effect that their proposals would have on hardworking Americans. My colleague from Washington State just a moment ago said, and I'll quote her again, "Everybody pays except the rich," under Republicans' idea of how things ought to be. And I think I pointed out that that's just not true. But in case anybody needs a reminder of who pays income taxes in this country, the top 1% pay 38% of all income taxes. The top 10% pay 70%. The bottom 40% pay no personal income tax. So, is it true that everybody pays except the rich? No. The rich pay by far and away most of the taxes paid in this country. And a lot of people believe that's as it should be. We have a progressive system. The rich can afford to pay more, and so we expect more from them. But let's not demagogue the issue and suggest that isn't true. It is true. The rich do pay more, and we've decided in this country that they should. But how much more do you want them to pay? 90%? 95%? How about 100%? How much revenue do you think we could get from somebody if we said that he's going to have to pay 100% of what he earns in income taxes? We know there are two rates at which you generate exactly zero revenue, 0 and 100. So when we talk about shared sacrifice, let's put this into perspective. And let's realize that we're not talking about sacrifice in the sense of trying to hurt people or austerity so much as we are talking about prosperity. And you don't create more prosperity with job-killing taxes. Mr. President, I just want to add one other thing for the record here. There are two publications that note areas in which we could save hundreds of billions of dollars if we were just willing to discuss them. When we talk about things that are on the table or off the table, here are two things that our Democratic friends have said are not on the table. We will not talk about fraud in the unemployment insurance system or fraud in Medicare and Medicaid. Well, according to these two articles, which I'll ask to be put in the record in just a moment, there are tens of billions of dollars in each where we could save the taxpayers money that is being paid out now to either downright crooks or being paid inappropriately to people who don't qualify. Since 1986, the GAO has published at least 158 reports about Medicare and Medicaid fraud, for example. In 1993, Attorney General Janet Reno declared health care fraud America's #2 crime problem, right behind the violent crime. These are off the table, some of our Democratic friends say. Well, we think that this is a way in which we can save money without requiring others to have to sacrifice. And so I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that the piece by Michael Cannon in the National Review Online dated July 4th and the piece by Paul Davidson from USA Today dated July 5th be inserted in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without objection.
Thank you. In closing, Mr. President, I appreciate my colleagues' indulgence here. The bottom line here is that when we talk about shared sacrifice, we need to appreciate that in the negotiations that have been occurring, Republicans have made a lot of concessions, and that the reason that we oppose the concession of raising taxes is not because we have some ideological attachment to somebody that makes a lot of money, but rather because we have an ideological attachment to the American worker who needs a job or who needs his or her job protected. And from what we understand, the taxes that have been proposed by our Democratic colleagues would all be job killers. At the time that our economy is in the unhealthy state it is, the worst medicine is job-killing taxes.
Would the Senator yield for a question?
Mr. President, I've been happy to yield. I'm also happy to conclude. I think we're rotating between Democrat and Republican.
I don't want to step on your colleague's time, but one of the things that I've been tracking is the share of wealth, income, and taxes at various percentages of the, towards the top. And the senator was good enough to mention that the top 1% pay about 28% of the taxes. The top 5% pay about 44%, a little over 44% of the taxes, and the top 10% pay 55.4% of the taxes. But I think in order to get a complete picture, it's also important to note that the top 1% control 24% of the income, the top 5% control 39% of the income, and the top 10% control 50% of the income. And if you go to wealth, the top 1% control 33.8% of the wealth, the top 5% control 60.4% of the wealth, and the top 10% control 71.5% of the nation's wealth. So if you control 71.5% of the, if you're at the top 10% and you control 71.5% of the nation's wealth, it doesn't seem to be unreasonable that you should be paying 55% of the nation's taxes, particularly if you are taxing based on dollars and not on just number of people. So I don't know if those numbers are wrong. We got them from the Federal Reserve Board, from the IRS, and from the Congressional Budget Office. I think they're accurate, and it would appear to show that at the very high end, although these individuals are paying considerable taxes towards our nation's economy, they are paying considerably less than the amount of wealth they control and not much more than the amount of income they control. And in a graduated system of progressive taxation, which we're supposed to have, that is not surprising. In fact, what's surprising is that the top 24% of the income only pays 28.3% of the taxes.
Well, Mr. President, I'm not sure where the question is in there, but what I would say in response is, with all due respect to my colleague, his numbers are absolutely wrong. I don't have at my fingertips the precise figures, but I can tell you this, that in every category that you mention, by the way, I don't also know what you mean by in charge of wealth. In terms of who owns wealth or income, the people in the upper brackets earn far more, pay far more in taxes than the percentage of wealth as a percent of the economy. And I would be happy to supply those figures to my colleague. And there is a difference between income taxes and all other taxes as well. And I don't know, that chart doesn't suggest which is which. I would be happy, though, to demonstrate to my colleague that whether you're talking about income taxes or all taxes, the upper income level pay far and away a higher percentage than those in the lower portion, and they pay more than the wealth in taxes. They pay more than the percentage of wealth that they create or that they earn. So the bottom line is that I think anybody making the argument that there is not shared contribution to the revenues of the country by the upper income would be making a false argument. I know that's not the argument my colleague is making, because he agrees with the progressive income tax system and has pointed out that it is progressive, even by the numbers you have. But let's do this, because I respect my colleague. I'll get the numbers that I rely upon. You get the numbers that you think you rely upon and the sources of each. You and I can agree to come to the floor at an appropriate time, convenient to us both, and then we can both have the data at our fingertips from which we can make our respective arguments. How's that?
I would be delighted to do that, and I might actually throw in the data from the IRS that shows that the top 400 income earners in the country, in the most recent period that they've actually gone back and done the calculation, paid 18.2% total taxes, which is less than I think the average American, certainly the average middle American family pays. And so there's this reversal at the high end where people actually end up paying less. Indeed, in one building in New York, the payment for the most recent year was 14.7% from the occupants, whereas janitors and doormen and security guards are paying up in the 20% ranges. So it's not progressive in that sense. It is regressive at the high ends, according to those things. So let's get the information together, and we'll have that discussion.
Sure. And, Mr. President, if I could, just on that last point, it makes a larger point. When Congress tries to hit the millionaires and the billionaires, those are the very people who can adjust their way of earning and of giving and of living so that they end up paying less in taxes. That's why it doesn't much matter what the rate of taxes is at the upper income. They're never going to pay more than a certain percentage because they can afford the lawyers and the accountants to make sure that they don't pay more. It's the people in the middle income that can't do that, and they end up paying what the IRS says they owe, and they can't adjust their way of living and giving in order to pay less in the way of taxes. Whatever deductions they get, and they're going to have to live with those. When we try to hit the upper income with higher rates, it generally doesn't work, and that's another reason why we think this is an ineffective way to raise revenue.
That's why I think the loopholes need to be closed, and I thank the distinguished senator for the colloquy.
Mr. President. Mr. President, it scared me for a minute. I thought we were almost engaging in a debate on the Senate floor. This could get interesting here. I have great respect for both my colleagues that were just making comments, and it'll be an interesting discussion on the floor when they both have their respective numbers, and we'll look forward to that. And I want to say to my colleague from Arizona that what he said is exactly right. Raising taxes is, in the time of tough economic times, is a very, very difficult thing to do and is not stimulative of the economy. The way we need to see revenues increased, and I don't think there's any disagreement from anybody in the Senate or in the House that the 14.5% of GDP that we are now seeing in revenues has got to be increased. But the way we need to increase it is enacting policies, whether it be tax policies or spending policies or otherwise, that will truly grow the economy. And we can do that with the right kind of policies that will not only in the short term stimulate the economy and show an increase in revenues, but it will also have the same impact on the other side of the ledger, which is reducing spending. We're now at an all-time high since World War II on the spending side. We're at an all-time low on the revenue side. And that's what's gotten us into this terrible fiscal problem that we have today. And I concur with what the senator from Arizona said. And I look forward to continuing to dialogue with him as well as the senator from Rhode Island about what needs to be done to get this gap closed. Mr. President, I want to rise tonight to discuss the need for the American government to fundamentally change the way it conducts business. Congress and the President can no longer fail to make significant, meaningful changes to our fiscal path. We must act now to ensure the safety and security of our nation. There's a mutual understanding from all involved in the ongoing debate that the current fiscal path our country is on will lead us to ruin. It is simply unthinkable to believe that we can continue to run deficits in excess of $1 trillion on top of $14.3 trillion in accumulated debt and remain the leader of the global economy. It is well known that the federal government will soon risk a potentially catastrophic default on its credit obligations. Clearly, any increase in the debt ceiling must come with substantial policy reforms and commitments that future spending and deficits are being addressed appropriately. Against this backdrop, we are being provided with a unique opportunity to review the underlying causes of our current path and potential effects that we face. Just last week, the Congressional Budget Office released its long-term budget outlook. Their release shows debt increasing to approximately 200% of GDP by 2035 unless drastic and immediate changes are made. Economists have told me that a debt equaling 90% of GDP is the tipping point, and that after that it is impossible to turn the situation around. Under the same CBO scenario, interest costs alone in 2035 would reach 9% of GDP, and 9% of GDP is more than what the United States currently spends on both Social Security and Medicare. This body spends a considerable amount of time deliberating on matters of national security, and indeed, that is extremely important work. We must stay vigilant that any threats to this country are swiftly dealt with. However, Admiral Mike Mullen, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has said emphatically over and again that our debt is the single greatest threat to our national security. Admiral Mullen is not alone. The co-chairs of the President's own Fiscal Commission warned him of the need for swift action. Mr. Bowles and Mr. Simpson continue to speak almost daily of the importance of addressing our fiscal situation and continue to make impassioned pleas that this situation must be corrected and must be done so in the short term. It is during these hard times that most Americans look to their elected representatives and the Chief Executive of the United States for guidance on these issues. The American people have waited for leadership on this issue and have demanded fiscal discipline. It is reprehensible that an issue of this magnitude and significance is subject to the partisan bickering and gamesmanship that often rears its head in politics. This is an issue that will determine the fate of our country. It deserves careful, serious, thoughtful deliberation and not political theater. Not long ago, the Senate held a series of votes on budget resolutions that everybody knew were determined to fail. The American people expect and deserve an honest budget debate and an honest budget process. And while I'm glad that the President is now engaging in this debate, he too has not been forthcoming or helping decide America's future budget fate. He has not given those in his party instructions or guidance on how to address our fiscal situation, nor has he given the Congress as a whole a relevant plan. It would be reprehensible for these White House negotiations that are now underway to produce a last-minute proposal that leaves Congress no time to review the merits of the legislation or the immediate and lasting effects to the American people. I've been on record many times before as stating everything must be on the table when it comes to solving our debt problems, and I seriously mean that. We see daily the effects of oppressive debt in countries like Greece and the fear and panic it creates for the citizens of that country. We must take the steps now to ensure we don't fall off the precipice, and that means looking at all of our options. We must reduce discretionary spending, reform entitlements, simplify the individual and corporate code, and lower tax rates. This is a proven path to prosperity because the solution is based on both spending reduction and economic growth. And we have a model for this. And the model is what Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan did in 1986. We saw an economy stimulated at a time when it really needed it by the elimination of tax expenditures and the lowering of tax rates, particularly on the corporate side. It's important on both the personal and corporate. But if we're truly going to expand our tax base and see revenues increase, then we need to make the corporations in this country that manufacture the finest quality of products of anybody in the world on the same level playing field as their competitors across the globe. So it's of critical importance that we reform our tax code, make it simpler and fairer, and particularly from a corporate level, more competitive from a worldwide situation. We must cut federal spending in any way we can. Our current levels of discretionary and mandatory spending simply cannot be sustained. But we can't solve our problems simply by reducing spending. We've got to reform entitlements. We've got to look at those issues that are very, very difficult for a lot of us to deal with. And we've got to make some hard and tough decisions. And the unfortunate part about this is we don't have a lot of time to do it. I don't know what the window is. The window may be 6 months, maybe 12 months, maybe 2 years. No economist will give you an exact, definite prediction of how long this window is. But the one thing we do know, that we were not able to predict the financial crisis that occurred in 2008. But as Mr. Bowles has said time and time again, this is one crisis we can predict. So now is the time for policymakers in Washington to act. It's job creation that will ultimately be the benefit to Americans once a strong and balanced federal budget is in place. Slower economic growth results in dramatic job loss. Christina Romer, the former chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, equated 1 percentage point of GDP with 1 million jobs annually. We cannot allow the American people to suffer by not providing the economic basis for recovery and growth. A balanced federal budget that is free of excessive debt will lead to a healthy economy and long-term sustainable job creation activities. Mr. President, I would yield the floor.
The senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I rise today deeply concerned that our Republican colleagues in their ideological haze have lost sight of the facts and the real people at home whose lives will be affected by the choices we make. They are lost in an ideological haze, a political dust storm that is distorting the facts and confusing process and policy with political propaganda. As the conservative columnist David Brooks has said, quote, a normal Republican Party would seize the opportunity to put the country on a sound fiscal footing. He calls it, quote, the mother of no-brainers. But it is true, as many have said, that this Republican Party is not your grandfather's Republican Party. It's not even Ronald Reagan's Republican Party. This Republican Party is so far to the right that it cannot even see the center where ideologies converge and good governance begins. This Republican Party sees the processes governing as one-sided, their side and no other. Today, those on the far right wave the Constitution that established a form of government to protect us from tyranny, yet see any form of compromise as defeat, and the only clear victory is total surrender to their position. And so here we are, working to try to ensure that reason prevails. We have offered the largest spending cuts in a generation, asking that those cuts be accompanied by closing tax loopholes and ending tax giveaways and unreasonable subsidies to those who need them the least. But because almost every Republican has signed Grover Norquist's Americans for Tax Reform pledge to never, ever raise any tax, and because they define closing tax loopholes as a tax increase, even when the recipients themselves have said they do not need those tax breaks, we are forced into this position, hoping that logical, moderate voices on the other side will rise up, demanding that what we do and is right for the American people take place. In my view, ending subsidies to big oil companies does not fall under that pledge. Only in Washington, would Republicans call ending $21 billion in tax breaks for big oil companies that will make $144 billion in profits a tax increase. It is not. It is not a tax increase. It is a measure of fairness. It is exactly what we need to do under the circumstances, and it is a reasonable offer by those of us on this side of the aisle. Now, our job in a representative democracy is to represent the values of those who sent us here, to do what's right for them, not wave a pledge and conveniently interpret the elimination of oil subsidies from multi-billion-dollar profitable corporations or ethanol subsidies to the tune of $2 billion as a tax increase. Mr. President, that's nonsense. We are offering a reasonable compromise, as that conservative columnist David Brooks says, the mother of no-brainers. Even USA Today said in their editorial, quote, compromise is an essential part of democracy, but negotiating with Republicans over taxes has become as futile as trying to bargain with the Taliban over whether girls should be allowed to attend school. Now, that's a pretty stark comparison, I admit, and I may not have gone that far, but frankly, our Republican brethren seem to hold to their ideology almost religiously. They see all things in black and white. They act as though they believe that those who disagree with that ideology are either unpatriotic or heretics, and that the only truth is their truth. What they have forgotten is that negotiating with those with whom we disagree and reaching a compromise is what good governance is all about. The other falsehood here is spending is not a democratic value, as our friends on the other side would have us believe. It is a Republican reality. It was the reckless spending of Republicans combined with a reckless tax policy and an ideology that let Wall Street run wild, turning a free market into a free-for-all market that brought us to where we are today. Let's remember, it wasn't long ago that the budget was, in fact, balanced during another Democratic administration, when we had budget surpluses as far as the eye could see. The day President Clinton left office, he handed the incoming president a $236 billion surplus with a projected surplus of $5.6 trillion over the following 10 years. When President Bush left office, he had turned a $236 billion budget surplus into a $1.3 trillion budget deficit, with projected shortfalls of $8 trillion over the next decade. And he handed the new president an economy that was headed off the cliff into a near depression. We have spent $786 billion unpaid for on President Bush's ill-advised, wrong-headed war of choice in Iraq because of some false allegations of weapons of mass destruction, a political experiment that distracted us from a war of necessity in Afghanistan, keeping us there far longer than necessary, at an additional cost of $430 billion unpaid for, a total cost for both wars unpaid for of $1.2 trillion. The Republican Party that will not now agree to 1 penny in revenue and demands only more spending cuts has fought to make tax breaks for the wealthy permanent that would cost this nation another $5 trillion. They have favored big business and Wall Street and a tax code that has resulted in major multi-billion-dollar corporations paying no taxes, yes, no taxes at all. In fact, a detailed Government Accountability Office study of corporate income taxes from 1998 to 2005 showed that 55% of large U.S. corporations reported no tax liability for at least one of those 8 years. Yet those same Republicans will look us in the eye in defense of their defenseless position and tell us that most individuals do not pay taxes either. What they will not say is that those individuals who do not pay taxes for a reason. They do not earn enough to pay income tax, and many of them are among the poorest of the poor. Only in Washington could such an indefensible position be accepted as defensible and logical. Only in Washington could Republicans support policies that benefit the wealthiest at the expense of the middle class. Only in Washington could Republicans tell a construction worker in New Jersey who has cut his budget to the bone and needs to work another job to pay the bills that we don't need to end tax loopholes and tax breaks to help pay the nation's bills, that we only have to cut more spending and give more money to the top 1% of the wealthiest in the country who control 45% of all of the wealth in America, and that they'll create more jobs, notwithstanding the fact that 12 years of tax cuts for the wealthiest created virtually no jobs at all. When Ronald Reagan and Bill Clinton increased the revenue side of the equation, it brought the greatest economic progress in the last half-century. But our Republican colleagues do not let the facts get in the way of their ideology. The fact is, if Joe, the construction worker in New Jersey, has cut his budget and his spending, has made the difficult choices about what he can afford and what he can't, and still can't meet bills that he has to pay with the money he earns, then he has to get a second job or work more hours or find a way to increase his income. And yet our Republican colleagues will look that construction worker in the eye and tell him he doesn't need to earn more. He needs to cut more and then cut again. Cut to the bone if necessary, but never, never do what needs to be done to increase the revenue side. Mr. President, only in Washington does such an argument seem reasonable. Only does this Republican Party make an absurd argument try to make sense. Never before has America waged two wars at the same time, struggled to invest in our infrastructure to create new jobs, and done so at a time of decreased revenue, and not seen the need at least to discuss the idea of closing tax loopholes and tax breaks for big oil and multi-billion-dollar corporations. Never before has any party claimed that we can do all of that and at the same time balance the budget on the back of seniors, students, middle-class families, and not even consider the shared sacrifice, a sacrifice that would end tax breaks for multi-billion-dollar corporations who in many cases don't even pay taxes. Never before has such illogic passed for logic. But our Republican colleagues will not take yes for an answer. We have said yes to spending cuts, more spending cuts than we have seen in a generation. Now they must say yes to common sense, fair increases in revenue, and choose good governance over political ideology. David Brooks, that conservative columnist I referred to, he said, the members of this movement talk blandly of defaults and are willing to stain their nation's honor, meaning that the country won't meet its obligations. We teach our children you have to meet your obligations. But this movement tells the country you don't have to meet your obligations. He goes on to say, if debt ceiling talks fail, independent voters will see that Democrats were willing to compromise, but Republicans were not. If responsible Republicans don't take control, independents will conclude that Republican fanaticism caused this default, and they will conclude that Republicans are not fit to govern. I would very rarely agree with Mr. Brooks, but I would agree that his observations in this case are absolutely right. This is about not only standing up for the nation's honor, it is about standing up for the nation's obligations. It is standing up to make sure that there is a fair and shared sacrifice, not those simply on the backs of middle-class working families in this country and those who have the least among us. That's the choice Republicans would have us make. It is a wrong choice for the nation. And I'm just hoping that we get to some sense of reality in this chamber that can help us move forward, have the nation be upheld in its obligations both at here and abroad, and not stop a ripple effect that will cause an enormous consequence to this nation's economy. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.